Hi everyone, Fresh here, and welcome to part 2 in our Primary Arms 5X SLX Microprism review. In part 1 we went through a more quantitative analysis of this particular fixed prism site. In shifting towards more of a qualitative analysis, we're going to examine some of the optical properties of this prism, some practical shooting footage, as well as how it compares to some upper magnification fixed power prism scopes. Let's get started. Looking through the scope, you can immediately notice a few things. There's nothing here completely out of the ordinary for a primary arms microprism. The overall sight picture is pretty clear. Your overall viewing window is completely free of glare. It's a nice optic to look through, and I don't have any major complaints. However, I do still notice a few remnants of the microprism line, including the 3x. Though it appears to be slightly improved on this particular prism, you still have a little bit of the warm color bias and coloration that's occurring within the glass. The edges are still a little bit prismatic, showing some of those warmer tones, and the greens appear slightly more orange and red in the sight picture on this bright sunny day. It's not a deal breaker, but it's a little bit bothersome that its competitor, about half the price, doesn't have this kind of issue. We're talking about the Vortex 5X Spitfire. Like we said in part 1, the field of view is not best in class. The appearance of a thin scope body in your field of view, however, makes this field of view feel a lot less claustrophobic than what some people claim on the internet. What we start noticing, however, here is a rather punishing eye box, and lack of flexibility in that eye box based on the scope's eye relief. Just like in part 1, this is what I would call a symmetric bias scope and in the negative. Your eye box shrinks rather precipitously when you go inside the stated eye relief and when you go outside the stated eye relief. Initially, I thought for sure this would be a problem for most shooters, especially those practicing in competition and military drills where a lot of odd positions may be employed in training. Go through a VTAC barrier trying to get on the ground and crawling, and you're going to have a lot of trouble trying to catch that sight picture. I can utilize my usual cope saying, hey, a tight eye box means that you won't have parallax shift. The problem is that a lot of practical shooters are not looking for that kind of talk, especially from someone who doesn't have direct military experience. The high hopes that I had for the little microprism that could were being dashed every second. I was extremely excited for the CSS Aurora, but I was reminded quite quickly that the etching would never look as good as that on a TA-31. It didn't help matters that Delta 34 and I also found some blurriness on the right side of the ranging reticle, something that is also prevalent on the 4X TA-31. Though I admire Primary Arms' modular mounting system for the scope base, I still can't help but think that the cantilever mount will snap at any moment due to the torque applied of any kind of impact from the side of the prism, either throwing off your zero or mechanically breaking this thing completely without a goofy looking straight mount that I just aesthetically don't like very much and really doesn't allow for a rear BUIS. I had pretty high hopes for this 12 o'clock mount as well. It sits at a near perfect position for night vision forward of the optic and shades the primary part of the forward objective from direct sun glare, which is pretty clever, a little bit like an ACOG. The Glock MOS mounting system didn't even bother me all that much either. My low 407C sits in a great position that is a little bit less than 4 inches off the rail center of the rifle. A couple of taps and pushes very quickly reveals the inherent mechanical flaws of this system as well. You don't need to be a mechanical engineer to know that there are a lot of mechanical flaws in this design. In placing the lightning cuts on the sides of this mount, you've created 2 separate deformation modes for 2 different hoops, which allows the top mounting plane of the red dot to actually rotate forward and back. I don't have terrible concerns on the side impact of this mount, but if you drop anything directly on this red dot, for sure the front of that mount will completely collapse. Drop the rifle on its side and the prism breaks. Drop the rifle upside down and your red dot and 12 o'clock mount breaks. And you get to pay twice as much as the nearest competitor. It was getting apparent that I just haven't learned my lesson. Here I was sitting again with another wannabe cheap ACOG. It gets a little bit Nietzschean too. Every prism scope out there is a wannabe ACOG. After poking around a little bit more on the scope, however, this happened. Remember the iBox issue that everybody was complaining about? What if you could use it to your advantage? You see, we run into a couple of problems between prisms, red dots, and LPVOs. With an LPVO, you have continuously variable magnification, all built in one unit, at the cost of weight. In a prism, you just have one fixed magnification. How do you combat that? You add a piggyback. In order to access that, however, you need to move your head and deal with a chin weld and lack of recoil control. LPVOs also have the advantage where some of them actually use a fiber dot, which you can effectively use like a red dot sight. If you want to do anything close to that on a prism, you have to utilize back shooting somehow. You can get a little bit of speed out of that. However, because of the offset of your eyes and your skull, you end up with accuracy issues when it comes to distance. So what if I told you that you could solve this without taking your hands off the rifle to press a lever, without breaking your cheek weld, and without shifting the focus of your eyes? Tilt your head a tiny bit, and voila. I think what Primary Arms did by accident here is make an occluded red dot sight. I mean, think about this for a sec. With a very small tilt of your head, you go from 5x to a 1x. Your dominant eye is still focused on the target, so you actually maintain 100% of the accuracy that you would have maintained at 5x. You can't do this on the 5x Spitfire, you can't do this on the 3x Microprism, this doesn't work on the 2x, and it doesn't work on the TA-31. Primary Arms, I have no idea if this was intentional, but you've just unlocked a fourth sighting skill set that's actually available on this prism. You can use your primary magnification, the piggyback red dot for daytime and night vision, back shooting in a pinch, and an even better solution, simply tilting your head slightly and not taking your focus or dominant eye off the target. In a sense, this single magnification prism is very close to a multi-magnification capable optic. If you plan to use this for the daytime, you actually don't need that piggyback necessarily. Alright, so what about the reticle? True, you can get this one with the 5X Gen 3 Prism, but there's something really nice and premium feeling about having this in a small sized package like this. Going through the settings, this thing's plenty bright. During the daytime, I could see a bright red chevron in the center. And because all you have to illuminate is a chevron and no circle dot, or any crazy thing like that, and the shake awake feature, and that 50,000 hour battery life at the medium setting sounds a little bit more believable to me. So let's think about the reticle holds here for a minute. We have the arranging stadia on the sides, we have the leading lines for 8.6 miles per hour, and we have a center chevron and multi-crosshair BDC with various wind holds. An excellent reticle. The problem is that it's a little bit hard to find this on Straylock Pro. Trigon Elite may or may not have that one directly. The best reticle that I could find that you can superimpose in this case is the Primary Arms ACSS reticle that was offered on the TA-31 briefly along with the ACSS Aurora. On Straylock, you'll be labeled ACSS 556/308/545. If you utilize full power M193, the reticle tracks quite nicely when sighted at 100 yards until about the 7th subtension leading on the way down, where the BDC kind of trails off a little bit, as expected from a 55 grain bullet, which is not terribly ballistically efficient. If we try M855, the first couple of subtensions up to about 6 are very similar to the 55 grain. When we get to 7, we don't see that drop off here. You could still sight that in at about 686 yards. And at the 8th half mark, you still get pretty close to practical accuracy for what an M855 could do, at about 778 yards. This is slightly outside of our specs of acceptability, but I think this still makes a well-rounded reticle out to very long ranges where many other factors are going to throw off those two particular distances. This is about as good a reticle as any that you can use for 5.56. At the various different mounting heights, this reticle tends to track quite well too. Here you can see with the high, medium, and low spacers that this thing doesn't have a problem, especially if you want to mount this optic a little bit lower, still maintain a piggyback mount, but have a different head size such that a chin weld is not as possible. For these reasons, I think the ACSS Aurora was really the natural successor for this 5X Prism update. I'll get into chevrons in another video, but the chevron here doesn't seem to obscure the target all that much. This tracks a little bit better. It allows for PID, I think a little bit better than the ACSS Raptor in the 3X Micro Prism. There's no circle dot to obscure larger targets, and there are no excessively illuminated spots to distract me from things potentially being covered. Again, combine the long-range capabilities of this reticle and the occluded capabilities of the tighter eye box, and I think you have a winner here. Okay, so what is this thing like to shoot at long range? I decided to stick with the recommended 100 yard zero, brought myself up to elevation, picked up some Winchester M855, and started getting to work at some mid to long range targets. At about 5,200 feet, this is the hold pattern that I was using for this new reticle. The simple German style post at the 300 yard marker made this very easy for first round hits at about 320 yards. Because of the elevation, the projectile will maintain a little bit more of its velocity at distance. So the normal 400 yard sea level hold was adjusted downwards a little bit. We get to a target at about 500 yards, and this is where the math and Kentucky windage started coming in. We predicted about anywhere from 5 to 8 miles per hour based on how the flags were blowing at distance. The ACSS Aurora has a little bit more wind holds than this reticle in particular, so I've superimposed the 5 and 10 mile per hour winds to show the grid that we had to use to get out to 500 with various crosswinds and gusts. Conveniently, there was no pesky 600 yard target to tease me for the rest of the day. However, there was one at about 705 yards that was just waiting to make fun of me at the other end. Again, this required a little bit of reticle bisection in order to properly get me to that adjusted, higher elevation 700 yard target. There's no recorded footage of the actual impact, but at least 4 impacts were made at distance within not too many shots, although with some careful trigger manipulation and a little bit of frustration on the side.
Got it. Hit. Okay. Ooh. Still. Right.
Alright, Fresh, so where's the 1,000 yard impact? You've done it with the 5X Spitfire, why not the Micro Prism? Well, unfortunately, I did not have access to the 1,000 yard range that weekend, and I couldn't get it reserved for another few weeks. So I just made do with what I had. Given how well 700 yards went off camera, with a heavy firing schedule and a hot barrel, I would predict that at 700 yards, this thing performed much better than the 5X Prism did at 600 yards a year prior. I'm confident that with a 16-inch carbine, M855, and this Micro Prism, 600 yard shots are an absolute breeze. Because of the 1/4 MOA per click, the guesswork is also taken out of the equation. You can actually true in this prism very precisely at 300 yards. A mandatory step in this process if you want to do long range shooting with 5.56. Though I was able to fight these conditions to reach out the distance, it left me a little bit wanting for that ACSS Aurora mill reticle. Due to the distances in elevation that I was experiencing between sea level and the 5,200 feet in the range that I was at, I needed 2 different sets of holds and to adjust everything by about a half sub tension. Factor that in with wind, and I'm creating these imaginary grids in my head. Again, this is not a problem for me, but this might be a problem for normal shooters or those who are trying to get first round hits, especially if their life depends on it. The Christmas tree of the Aurora grid actually allows you to count the subtensions left and right and up and down, yielding a far more precise and higher probability shot solution. This is a reticle that I think I will revisit in the future. However, my initial impressions on this thing is that short range capability and PID will be affected slightly because of the absolute clutter of this Christmas tree, especially since you have a smaller field of view. More on that on another follow-up episode. Okay, so what about the usual night vision portion? Just like the Vortex, you do have some night vision capable settings that allow for a decent amount of reticle illumination. The problem is that shooting at distance will require some kind of IR illumination that can send a noticeable signature to an adversary. And since this is not tactically advantageous, I probably wouldn't recommend using the magnified portion necessarily. You're going to have some trouble using a single monocular PVS-14 with this particular prism on its night vision settings. However, if you are running a dual tube setup, you can take advantage of some of the occluded conditions that we saw during the daytime. The tube on your non-dominant eye actually allows you to still perform back and fully occluded shooting with night vision. Essentially, you have a chevron red dot that doesn't really need a piggyback if you're running a dual setup. For those running a single PVS-14, just slap a hollow sun on top or an RMR of your choice and get on with it. The dot is about the perfect distance forward and an excellent height for clearing your monocular on the top of the prism. Nothing really fancy to see here. So with this information so far, I'm sure this is going to raise a couple of questions. As a new consumer, should I buy the 5X Micro Prism over the 5X Vortex Spitfire? The answer really is, it depends on how much you want to pay. The Vortex may not exactly be out of the box ready, especially with the weak mounts that it comes with. It's about half the price, has a more solid piggyback solution, a larger field of view, and better coloration. In many ways, it makes a great recreational and hunting setup. If you want to just jump into the space and have fun, I think the Vortex is a great entrance at just $200. If, however, you want a little bit more modularity for a backup iron sight, a little bit more strength from the mounting system, and a lot more precision for going longer distances, I think the Primary Arms 5X Micro Prism is a lot more serious option and entrance into that space. Add the addition of sighting flexibility, and I think the PA is actually worth the extra $200 more. Take into account the addition of two excellent reticles, and you have quite an appealing mid-tier prism package. So then the absolute burning question comes up again is, how does this compete with the ACOG line? Optically, it's better than a TA33. Packaging-wise, it's much better than a TA11, leaving us with the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the 4X TA31. The traditional TA31 has a much larger field of view, a lot crisper reticle, much better optical coloration, and a simply stronger mounting solution for only 3 ounces extra. It's waterproof down to 100 meters, has equally precise click adjustments, and the fiber optic redundancy that you would want in a SHTF situation. Though the TA31 has a shorter eye relief, that overall eye relief is just simply more flexible than the 5X. Its eye box is also a lot more forgiving in every way. What if we change the rules just a tiny bit here, however? Let's try a more updated digital ACOG, the TA02. This being a slightly more apples to apples comparison, the choice between them comes down to this. Do you pay $1,600 sticker for short eye relief, a large field of view, 10 extra ounces, and the most durable optic that you've ever seen? Or do you want a better reticle, a more modular mounting system, greatly reduced weight, and the chance for occluded shooting, all for about a quarter of the price? Ultimately, I think that choice is yours. Based on the mechanical features of the optics alone, however, you would be less than serious to choose the Primary Arms in a military or durability type situation. The mounts are simply not strong enough. If you want an absolute serious piece of kit that you can bang around and still rely on to hold zero, you end up with the ACOG TA31 or the TA02. If you, however, want to practice your way towards an ACOG and even have a somewhat enhanced version of that experience, the Primary Arms 5X Micro Prism will get you pretty close. And you don't have to pay 4 times as much to get a reticle that Trijicon no longer offers and was still one of the best in their line. And therefore, for many reasons, this optic, despite perhaps some of the haters, is an absolute genius product release. In some sense, it gives you 85 to 95% of what an ACOG will do at a quarter of the price. That is not math that you could just simply ignore. Some of the flaws on this Prism are quite noticeable, but I think it's almost criminal to overlook how many things this thing is able to get right. And for this reason, I will be keeping my 5X Micro Prism. Thank you guys for sitting through this extremely long review. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, leave a comment, and I will see you guys on the range.